Welcome to the July meeting of the Transportation Advisory Committee. Good to see you folks. Always nice to share some time with you as we talk about the important business of our roads and highways and keep Mr. Ivy in business. So as we
in progress.
As we will remind you, this is a virtual meeting, and when we have an action item that we must take a vote on, Kelly will call your name and roll, and if you'll either affirm or not affirm your opinion on the action item, that would be appreciated. We have confirmed that we do have a quorum today. Also remind you that you've had a chance to look over the agenda and our TAC preparation booklet. And if you have any items that you may feel you have an ethical conflict of interest in, please identify that right now so we can excuse you from voting on that matter. Does anybody have a potential conflict of interest with any of the items coming before the committee today? If not, very good. First section, Kelly, Hunter, do we have anybody online for public comments?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Very good. If there are no individuals wanting to make a public comment, we'll close that segment of our committee meeting. Members, you've had a chance to look over the minutes of our last meeting. That would be the May 19th, 2022 meeting. Are there any corrections, additions that anyone would like to make?
Excuse me, Chairman Horn, I believe we're supposed to call the roll to begin the meeting.
Oh, are we?
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay. Well, you know, Mr. Clark, it's your job to keep me straight. I wish you'd
I will try to do that.
Please do that for me. Kelly, I guess it's important we go ahead and call the roll so we do establish the quorum on record.
Yes, sir. All right. Mr. Clark, Robert Clark.
Here.
Mr. Rick Cross.
Here.
Mr. Brett Rocket.
Here.
Mr. Mike Combest.
Here.
Mr. Bill Apple.
Here.
Mr. Mike Horn.
Here.
Mr. John Byron.
Here.
Mr. Wesley Hutchins.
Here.
Miss Benita Finney.
I'm here.
Mr. Rick Morris.
Here.
Mr. Willie Clark. Mr. Willie Clark.
He's on mute.
Present.
That concludes it.
Very good. Thank you.
Also, Myra Marion is present.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Marion. All righty. With that, members, if there are no changes or additions to the minutes of our May meeting, entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Sound like Mr. Combest made the motion. Mr. Cross made the second. Any discussion? Kelly, if you'll call the roll, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Robert Clark.
Aye.
Mr. Rick Cross.
Yes.
Mr. Brett Rocket.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Combest. Mr. Combest.
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn.
Yes.
Mr. John Byron.
Yes.
Mayor Myron.
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins.
Yes.
Miss Finney.
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris.
Yes.
And Mr. Willie Clark.
Yes.
That concludes it.
Very good. Thank you. Those are approved unanimously. Our third item on the agenda today is consideration of our fiscal year 2020-29 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program amendments. Hunter, will you take a second? You're in a new role today. This is your item. If you would just briefly introduce yourself for those of us who are not familiar with you in this new role. Now, you're replacing Byron, who has left us for Burlington, and our condolences to him.
Hi, thanks, Mayor Horn. Transportation planner. here for the City of Winston-Salem and Winston-Salem MPO. You've seen me here presenting before, but you are absolutely correct that I'm taking over for Byron on the presentation front for our TAC and TCC meetings. I look forward to working with all of you, and I guess with that, should I get started with our agenda item number 4?
Yes, sir, please.
All right, thank you very much. The item before you today is action item number 4. It's the consideration of fiscal year 2020 to 2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program amendments and modifications for the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. The fiscal year 2020 to 2029 MTIP is a comprehensive list of all transportation projects programmed for the Winston-Salem urban area and must be a subset of the Winston-Salem Urban Area 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan, as well as match the MPO's projects in the FY 2020 to 2029 State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. The North Carolina Department of Transportation regularly updates the STIP to include new projects and modify existing projects. Any STIP amendment for new statewide projects or projects within the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization triggers the amendment of the MTIP. STIP amendments for regionally significant projects that have significant project revisions or cross the Federal Highway Administration's 4-year funding period or modeling horizon years require an AQCDR. Modifications to the STIP do not require adoption, but are provided for information. The attached document here today describes the additions, deletions, amendments, and modifications to the Winston-Salem Urban Area's FY 2020 to 2029 MTIP. As required by the MPO's public participation policy, the amendments and modifications to the 20 to 2029 MTIP were made available for public review between April 11th to May 12th, 2022. And during that time, no comments were received. Be happy to take any questions at this time.
Any questions for Hunter?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
it's Robert Clark. Question, just looking at this, there's a lot of money here. Is the STIP, I'm assuming it's more of a planning document than a budget document, because typically, I mean, one of these projects is 32 million, one's 40, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have any budgetary constraints on these changes and modifications, or we simply do what we want to do and see how much money we got when the year comes?
I can attempt to answer that one, and then Pat Ivy can correct me if I'm not saying it correctly. But these are actual budgeted projects. So they're in the STIP. They are funded by, and probably the one you're referring to is a state project.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So these are funded. These are doable projects.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Members, any additional questions? You've had a chance to review this. Entertain a motion, please.
Move approval, Clark.
Second, Apple.
Mr. Clark makes the motion. Mr. Apple makes the second. Any further discussion? Kelly, roll the dice.
Mr. Robert Clark voted yes. Mr. Rick Cross,
Yes.
Mr. Brett Rocket,
Yes.
Mr. Mike Cumbest,
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple voted yes.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn,
Yes.
Mr. John Byron,
Yes.
Mr. Myron Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Wesley Hutchins,
Yes.
Miss Benita Finney,
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris,
Yes.
and Mr. Willie Clark.
Yes.
That concludes it.
Thank you. That's unanimous. Matt, I believe you have our next item.
I do. Thank you, Chairman Horn. Oh, somebody say something. Did I hear something? Okay.
Chairman Horn, did we not miss item 3?
Was that,
That's
No.
the remote meeting.
I'm sorry, Mr. Clark.
That's the remote meeting.
Oh, we moved that. I'm sorry, Mr. Clark. I should have made a mention of that in the beginning. Since that is not an action item tonight, we've moved it down to items for information. We're going to have a discussion when we get down there.
Good.
But you're absolutely correct. Your agenda would not have reflected that. I should have called everybody's attention to that in the very beginning. Thanks for not falling asleep on us. All righty, Matt, you're up.
All right, thank you, Chairman Horn. Good afternoon, TAC. Action item number 5 is consideration of a resolution to reallocate funds for fiscal years 2017, 18, and 19, Section 5307 Job Access and Reverse Commute projects, and fiscal years 2013, 14, 17, 18, and 19, Section 5310 Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities projects. The Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization staff is requesting the reallocation of funding for several awards across FTA Section 5310 and 5307 JARC. Subrecipients utilize 5310 and 5307 JARC funding to provide transportation access for seniors and for individuals with disabilities, and for low-income individuals requiring transportation to access jobs where they would otherwise not have access. Redistributing these funds through subrecipients we are certain will be able to use those funds to support community needs is one of the primary goals in transit management, so that prior year funding grants can be closed. This will also allow for easier transition processes in future fiscal years. For fiscal year 19, Section 5310, the town of Kernersville will relinquish $45,000, which will be redistributed to 3 other subrecipients because they have outstanding reimbursement balances for previous years. For fiscal years 2017 and 2018, Section 5310, Wake Forest Baptist Health Campus will relinquish $8,905 for both years because use of this funding was not pursued. For fiscal year 20, Section 5307 JARC, Horizons Residential Care for fiscal year 2019, Community Transportation Program for 2018, and Winston-Salem Urban League will relinquish reimbursement awards to be redistributed to subrecipients in need of further funding. Horizons could not meet the intended uses of the funding, while CTP and the Urban League were affected by COVID-19. The attached tables reference what subrecipients are having their funds redistributed, as well as which subrecipients will be receiving further funds for future reimbursement. This item is being brought to TAC as a group, so many reallocations can take place at one time and make way for further and more efficient reallocations as needed. I'm happy to take any questions on this.
Thank you, Matt. To summarize in 30 words or less, these are monies that were already budgeted and funded from previous years that we are now reallocating for the current and future budget year. So we don't lose those monies and we can close out those accounts.
That's correct.
Very good. Any questions for Matt, please?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how long can those funds sit in there? I mean, is there a limit? Is it, well, it can't be 5 years, it has to be more than that, but.
So I can especially speak to the oldest funding, the 2013 and 2014. Those need to be closed at the end of this fiscal year, and so we're working most closely with those funds to make sure that those are reallocated and closed out. But with COVID and other circumstances, FTA does tend to give us a little bit more leeway than they otherwise suggest at the time of the award. But in general, yes, you're right that it's longer than 2 years plus the year of the award, which is the general expectation for these funds.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly. Any other questions, please? If not, we'll entertain a motion.
Move approval, Clark.
Second, Alamein.
Mr. Clark makes the motion. Welcome, Mr. Alamein makes the second. Kelly, if you call the roll, please.
Mr. Robert Clark voted yes. Mr. Alamein voted yes. Mr. Ray Cross.
Yes.
Mr. Brett Rocket.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Combest.
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn.
Yes.
Mr. John Byron.
Yes.
Mr. Myron Marion.
Yes.
Mr. Wesley Hutchins.
Yes.
And then Miss Finney.
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris.
Yes.
And Mr. Willie Clark.
Yes.
I believe that concludes it.
Very good. Thank you. That sounds unanimous. Thank you, any members. All righty. Matt, you also have our next item, please.
Thank you. Agenda item number 6 is consideration of the FTA Formula Program Section 5307 funding allocations for Winston-Salem urban area for fiscal year 2022, with plans to amend the fiscal year 2020 to 2029 MTIP for operating and capital assistance. Transit systems located in urbanized areas of more than 200,000 in population are eligible to use Federal Transit Administration Sections 5307 funds for operating and capital assistance. FTA has announced an allocation of $6,703,372 for fiscal year 2022. There currently are 3 transit agencies in the MPO eligible to receive 5307 funding based upon data reported to the National Transit Database. They are Davidson County Transportation, Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation, and Winston-Salem Transit Authority. The number of eligible agencies may increase in future years. Additionally, activities traditionally eligible under the Job Access Reverse Commute or JARC program, which provides access for low-income individuals, continue to be an eligible activity for these funds. Based upon policies adopted by the Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO in 2017, funding will be distributed in accordance with the percentages developed by FTA as shown in Table 3A. Based upon percentages in that table, it is recommended that Davidson County Transportation receive $240,738, Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation receive $746,080, and Winston-Salem Transit Authority receive $5,661,554, and $55,000 be used for traditional 5307 JARC programs. Each year, MPO staff shall coordinate a joint allocation meeting with eligible agencies to confirm that the funding identified can be used by the agency and staff, and will use that information for recommendation to the TAC for final approval and distribution. MPO staff coordinated a meeting with the 3 transit agencies, and all 3 have agreed with the funding recommendations provided. Staff will also recommend approval of an amendment to the MTIP. I can take any questions on this as well.
Very good. Thank you, Matt. Any questions, please?
Mr. Mayor, this is Mr. Clark. Do
Yes,
we
sir.
know how this 6.7 million compares to previous years? Wouldn't you want to have that?
I could definitely confirm that it is larger, but I'll have to look up the exact figures for you.
If you wouldn't mind,
2021.
we have a fairly large bus system, and to just be curious to see how this compares to maybe the last 2 years or so.
Sure.
It is
Yeah.
more, Councilmember Clark, and we can get you that information.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Horn, I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Does anybody know what's the criteria that determines the percent of apportionment? Is it population? Is it utilization of the services? What goes into the actual percentage assignment?
Do you want me to answer that, Matt?
You can, and I could add on if needed.
No, go ahead, Matt. I'll let you do it.
Oh no, I was just going to say it's a percentage that's dictated by ridership within the MPO as well as the population within the MPO, and then the number of buses that are serviced to the population in the MPO as well.
Would you like me to add to that?
It's data, yes, that goes to the National Transportation Database, and it's a formula program, and we could get you that information on how they calculate the formula, but Matt is right, it is based upon miles of service and some additional information. Was it you, Scott, that said you were going to chime in?
Yes, ma'am, I could if you'd like me to.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Very good. Mr. Bynum, this is the largest, the Urbanized Area 5307 program is the largest program for FTA across the entire country. 5307 is basically broken up into 3 different categories. There's a category of urbanized areas, 50,000 to 200,000. That program allocation is based on population and population density. That's it. That's representing the city of High Point, city of Burlington. You get a second category tier, which is that is essentially 200,000 to 1 million. That is based on population density, and then gets into the operating statistical data that's reported to the National Transit Database that Matt was speaking of, that specifically gets into ridership and usage of your service levels. So those are basically what we're talking about is we have formulas that are tied into the urbanized area allocations that come from Congress. 5307 has 3 different tiers. Winston-Salem is in that tier of 200 to 1 million, just like the city of Greensboro and other areas across the country. And then you get into the higher tier, which is 1 million plus, which also is population density, has the same elements with regards to operating statistics. But from the federal standpoint, they basically take the overall appropriation from Congress, put in a percentage into these 3 different categories as far as total, and then it disperses out towards the different urbanized areas of those 3 different tiers.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan and the others for your answer. I was just curious if I heard population being part of the answer. Curious if the feds are quick to send new census data for these computations, or are we still going off decade-old data?
No, it's technically speaking, census has not been put into the formula allocations formally because census has not been recorded across the country. And yes, the other element with that, when we talk about National Transit Database, which is a very important aspect of federal reporting that urbanized areas have to report, there is a 2-year lag that traditionally goes into that. So essentially what we report in 22 would go through all the agencies across the country, no excuses, there's just a lot of data. It basically takes 2 years before that is put into the 24 appropriations. And then we throw in COVID and everything's essentially another year behind schedule. So data is used, census is put in place, but census traditionally, even though it's on a 10-year cycle, does not get put into formula programs until census is officially accepted, and we're not at that point across all marks with regards to census data.
Thank you.
I guess the obvious question then is, then why do we take the census if we're not going to report and use the data? That's beyond the scope of this committee, Mr. Chairman, but one would ask, wouldn't one?
Well, I'm pretty sure Scotopedia has an answer for that, but we'll save that maybe for a future episode.
Well, I apologize, that's off topic, but yet it's really not.
Very good. Any other questions, please? All righty. If not, we'll entertain a motion, please.
Move approval. Clark.
Second, Apple.
Mr. Clark makes the motion. Mr. Apple makes the second. Any further discussion? Kelly, take the stage.
Mr. Robert Clark voted yes. Mr. Elamine. Mr. Elamine. All right, Mr. Rick Cross.
Yes.
Mr. Brent Rocket.
Yes.
Mr. Mike Combest.
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple voted yes. Mr. Mike Horn.
Yes.
Mr. John Byron.
Yes.
Mr. Myron Marion.
Yes.
Mr. Wesley Hutchins.
Yes.
Miss Benita Finney.
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris.
Yes.
And Mr. Whitty Clark.
Yes.
That concludes it.
Elamine votes yes too.
Thank you, members. Matt, let's keep the short name short because you have the third or the next item.
All right. This is agenda item number 7, which is the consideration of the fiscal year 2022 FTA section 5339 bus and bus facilities grant program funding allocation for the Winston-Salem urban area and amending the MTIP. Federal Transit Administration section 5339 program is a formula-based grant program to replace, rehabilitate, and purchase buses and bus facilities. The program provides available federal resources to eligible direct recipients that operate fixed route bus services or that allocate funding to fixed route bus operators. The program originated through the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, or MAP 21, which changed the program from discretionary to formula-based. Funding is now designated to states and designated recipients in urbanized areas of 200,000 people or more. The Winston-Salem urban area is eligible to receive $556,276 in fiscal year 2022. WISTA is requesting to use the available funds to purchase 3 Transaid vans to replace aging fleet, and the remaining funds for transit facility rehabilitation projects and capital maintenance. Public participation period was held for 30 days between May 23rd and June 23rd of 2022. There were no comments received. In order for WISTA to have these funds made available, the steps to follow include approval by the TAC, programming and amending of the MTIP, and the 2020 to 2029 STIP, and submission to FTA. And we can take any questions on this as well.
Thank you, Pat. Any questions? Very good. If not, we'll entertain a motion, please.
Move approval. Clark.
Second,
Combest.
Mr. Clark makes the motion. Mr. Cross beat Mr. Combest in by a nose. Has the second. Any further discussion? Kelly?
Mr. Robert Clark voted yes. Mr. Elamine?
Yes.
Mr. Rick Cross voted yes. Mr. Brent Rocket?
Yes.
Mr. Mike Combest?
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple?
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn?
Yes.
Mr. John Byron?
Yes.
Mr. Myron Marion?
Yes.
Mr. Wesley Hutchins?
Yes.
Ms. Benita Finney?
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris?
Yes.
And Mr. Willie Clark?
Yes.
That concludes it.
Thank you, members. That's unanimous. Matthew?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, TAC members. The item before you is an amendment to the Winston-Salem urban area fiscal year 2020 through 2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program to adjust surface transportation block grant, direct attributable funding for projects in the Village of Clemens. So the Village of Clemens is requesting additional funding for 2 sidewalk projects along Harper Road, and those are EB 5960 and EB 6040. The scope of those projects includes the design and construction of sidewalk from Frank Morgan Elementary School to the Jerry Long YMCA, excuse me, and from Village Point Drive to east of the I-40 interchange. Both projects were evaluated, recommended, and approved for STB-GDA funding in previous years by this body. The Village wishes to transfer all STB-GDA funding from Project U4741PE, which was to design and construct sidewalk along Highway 158 and the Yadkin River Greenway, phase 1 of that project, to the above mentioned projects. The Village would like to transfer $738,640 to EB 6040 and $1,371,760 to EB 5960. The proposed federal funding amounts for EB 6040 and EB 5960 are $1,269,800 and $2,371,760 respectively. The Village has provided the following reasons for canceling U4741 PE project: periods of inactivity due to funding uncertainty, significant increases in the cost of the project, and the potential for road expansion by NCDOT. The Village will repay the already expended STB-GDA amount of $181,121 incurred under the U4741 PE project. The Village is also prepared to contribute the $527,600 to the projects to account for the 20% local match for the federal funding portion, which is $2,110,400. Attached are memos from the Village of Clemens detailing that request to transfer these funds and some maps of the affected projects. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Matthew. Mr. Combest, do you have any comments before we vote on this?
No, thank you, Mayor. I think that was perfectly described.
Very good. Any questions for Matthew?
Chairman, I have one question. This is
Yes,
Brent.
sir.
On the Yadkin River Greenway, is there 2 portions of that according to that map?
Yes, there were 2 sections of that. I know there's one section directly along the river, and then there was one internal to the park.
Okay, thank you, Matthew.
Sure.
Any additional questions? Kelly, please call the roll.
don't we need a motion?
I'm sorry, I thought we had a motion.
So therefore, I'll make a motion. This is Cross.
Elamine, second.
Mr. Cross makes the motion. Mr. Alhameen makes a second. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, is that the Yadkin River Greenway project? Is that what's reflected on the last drawing for U4741 PE?
That's correct, sir.
Those are the 2 sections. The purple lines are the 2 sections of that greenway.
That's correct. Yeah, within the park, there are two sections of Greenway, and then there's another purple section along US 158 representing that proposed sidewalk as well.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be sure I understood.
Matthew, keep my memory straight here, but I believe this was somebody's whistling at me. I believe this was the outshoot of a Greenway study that was funded jointly, I think, certainly by Louisville and by Clemens a number of years ago. And it was a very ambitious project that we potentially would have a Greenway that would connect the two communities. And maybe even Winston-Salem had a finger in that as well. But I think as we all began to take a look at the potential of doing this, we found that there was significant resistance among property owners who really didn't want greenways going through their backyards, and the significant cost that was going to cost. So it was a great idea, but I just don't think, it was a great study. It was a good consultant recommendation, but it wasn't practical when we started putting real dollars to it. Matthew, is that pretty close?
Yeah, I think that accurately reflects where the project is right now.
Very good. We do have a motion and we have a second. Any further discussion? Kelly?
Mr. Robert Clark?
Yes.
I think Mr. Elamine voted yes. Mr. Rick Cross voted yes. Mr. Brent Rocket?
Yes.
Mr. Mike Combest?
Aye.
Mr. Bill Apple?
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn?
Yes.
Mr. John Byron?
Yes.
Mr. Myron Marion?
Yes.
Mr. Wesley F. Hutchins?
Yes.
Miss Benita Finney?
Yes.
Mr. Rick Morris?
Yes.
And Mr. Willie Clark?
Yes.
Thank you, members. That is unanimous. That concludes our action items for today. Mr. Clark, who so astutely caught the following item as an informational item discussing our virtual meeting plans for virtual meetings or in-person meetings. Tanique, do you want to give us just the thumbnail on that, please? Or Kelly, I'm sorry, Kelly.
Yes, sir, I can. So the item before you was up for consideration, and the reason it was moved for information is because we have to be in person in order to vote on the remote participation. If you all can remember, in April of 2020, the TAC did vote on behalf of the MPO to allow for remote participation for TAC and TCC under the state of emergency. On June 21 of 2022, the City Council voted to allow various boards and commissions to continue to meet remotely even after the state of emergency has been rescinded or expires upon the majority vote of the membership. So this would only happen provided that the public is afforded access to the meeting in the same manner as that previously afforded, and also that all notice and procedures set forth in the laws were adhered to. So consistent with that ordinance, staff is actually making the recommendation or that will allow TCC and TAC upon the majority vote of TAC to continue to meet remotely as a committee until further notice. Although we are not required to do so, staff is also making the recommendation that TAC and TCC meet in person for public hearings as well as for election of officers. So for us, that's usually in January. The item is a little bit confusing because it seems to indicate that we are recommending a mixed format of meeting that is in person and virtual, but that is not the case. The item will be corrected if that is the decision of the board to indicate that it would be an either all virtual meeting or all in-person meeting, but not one meeting that's a hybrid.
Thank you, Kelly. Members, if you recall, I believe it was either the last meeting or the meeting before that, we had kind of a poll of members and we were talking about meetings in person or meetings virtually. It seemed to be the overwhelming preference of members to continue to meet virtually. We knew we were able to do that for as long as there was a state of emergency declared, but with that state of emergency going to be rescinded, this action is necessary for us to make that determination for ourselves. So the question before us, would you wish to meet in person, or would you wish to meet virtually as we're currently doing now? And we can instruct the staff then to develop the appropriate action item for us at our next meeting, which would have to be in person, unfortunately.
Kelly, I have a question. My understanding is that a consideration this time was that you felt you could get a higher level of participation for this meeting by doing it virtually. Is that correct?
That is correct. We had a little bit of trouble meeting quorum in person.
Okay. You anticipate that being the same circumstances going forward through the year? Who knows? Who knows, huh?
Who knows?
Okay.
But
thank you.
I do think historically, in-person meetings, we always had a harder time getting a quorum. Because I mean, some of y'all in your pajamas out there, you know, sitting at home. Mike's probably in shorts with a gin and tonic beside him.
Boy, I tell you, you are not far wrong.
But you know, I only have to walk downstairs. I'm sitting in City Hall right now, but for a lot of folks, they got to get in the car and drive a while. So my preference would be to continue with remote meetings, except for the ones we have to.
I'll ask a question before we decide. Has the quality of the decisions made by this committee been impacted materially one way or the other since we switched to virtual?
I don't think so. I don't think the quality has necessarily changed, but it's just like Councilmember Clark was saying, it's just a lot easier. It has been to meet quorum when we have been virtual as opposed to previous years when some months are harder than others.
To me, that makes it easy. If we're achieving the same quality of decision and we are generating a greater participation, it seems a no-brainer. We keep doing it.
Yeah, I had one
sorry,
comment,
go ahead.
Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman.
Floyd, please.
Yeah, given the slight uptick we've had in our COVID, unfortunately, for Forsyth County, that should be given serious thought in our decision making. And I'm literally in Denver, Colorado right now participating in this meeting. That would not happen if I had to be there personally. So my vote is for the virtual meeting to be continued.
Mr. Combes, I think, or Michael, I think the one thing that we do miss, and certainly that I do miss, is the collegiality that occurs when we can be there in person and make that kind of contact. The other 2 points you're making are absolutely correct. I think we're probably more efficient. We probably have greater participation when we do it this way. Members of the thoughts?
I would concur with that. Apple?
I agree. We need to stay virtual. Rick Morris.
I agree. This is Myron Marion, and also as long as we have access, for the public is allowed to still participate in our meetings, I'm in agreement.
Anyone else?
I'm in agreement with everyone else. I think we should keep the remote.
So just to clarify, we're talking about continuing virtual until such time in the future. I mean, we're not going to be making these decisions every month, are we? Or are we? Is that the intent? I'm a little confused about some of the wording in this document.
No, sir. So some of the document will be reworded. So the idea is that we would meet remotely, and we would only meet in person when we have to do election of officers in January, or if there's an item that requires a public hearing. The reason for that is we wanted to just make sure that we give the public extra opportunities to come see us in person for an item that requires a public hearing.
Okay. Thank you.
Members, any other thoughts?
Just a question on that. If we, on those circumstances where we meet physically, will the public have an opportunity to participate remotely as well?
No, sir. It will be advertised as an in-person meeting, and a location will be advertised to the public as well. So they would come like they would in person.
I would offer that we may want to reconsider that, because that seems to make it more difficult for the public to participate by requiring them to come downtown. Whereas if we afforded a virtual option, instinctively it seems we would offer the opportunity to increased participation.
Kelly, was there some kind of legislative or other reason why we decided to have public hearings in person?
No, sir. It was a recommendation because historically, we wanted to make sure that those that wanted to participate in a public hearing were able to do so. The people that I have heard, the one person I guess thus far that I have helped for a comment, it was a little bit difficult to get them to get online and walk them through the process, where it seemed to have been easier in the past when we were meeting in person. If somebody had a public hearing that they wanted to add to a public hearing, they could find us. That was just the idea behind it, but it's a recommendation. So if the board feels that virtual option, virtual is necessary for public hearing as well, then we can continue the meetings virtually, even for public hearings.
I guess my question would, why does it have to be either or? If someone wanted to come downtown and participate and perhaps use the video facilities that are available there to staff, or participate in some other venue in person, or someone else wanted to participate virtually, can we facilitate both options?
Yes, so that was an option that was considered. We actually also talked to members of other NPOs around the state, and the consensus, from my observation, having talked to different people and having been part of both virtual and in-person meeting, it is sometimes hard to conduct the meeting when some people are not present because people talk on top of each other. But the biggest issue was that we did not necessarily have a room that would allow that technology.
Mr. Chairman, if I can add,
yes, ma'am.
The one other thing is, when you're meeting in person, you will no longer be meeting at the Bryce Stewart building, but the facility where you would be meeting would now be at the Jocelyn V. Johnson Municipal Services Center on Lowry Street. It's a much larger room that allows for some level of social distancing, and there are no petitions or anything in between the seating, but you would be coming to a different location. So I did want to make sure that we pointed that out as well.
I would just comment, Apple here, commenting on Kernersville's experience with live streaming, virtual, with the alderman being present. I think we're averaging somewhere in the 7 or 8 people, including a couple of staff people who actually take advantage of the live stream. It's available on our YouTube channel by 2 a.m. the morning following the meeting, the alderman meeting. So it's not widely used. It's there, but one would think that you would get significantly more participation from those who can't physically get there. But that's not really been borne out very significantly in Kernersville.
Members, other thoughts, please?
By the way, for everybody's information, the building that was referred to is about a mile from here. It's over near Winston-Salem State. You can see it from the interstate. It's the old Boston building. For any of you old folks out there, remember that. We made industrial air conditioning units there.
Robert, I know people who are old enough to remember that, but thank you for that.
I'm old enough to remember that. My brother worked there one summer.
Folks, Mr. Combast has raised an issue. What's your feeling about trying to do? I think staff and I talked about this, and I think staff has explored the possibility of having a combination in-person and virtual. It creates a number of challenges, and I'm not sure that we actually get the return on investment for them to try to put that together. Thoughts? So here's our options. Let me lead us on the path of maybe a suggestion. Let us move to a virtual meeting. Let us have our public public hearings also virtually. I think the only other meeting that we probably need to have, or we are required to have in person, would be our election of officers meeting. And I think, Kelly, that's one that is required, right?
I don't even believe that is required, sir. That's really up to the board.
Okay, great. So we have no requirements whatsoever. We could play in the metasphere forever.
Let's verify that just to be sure. I check with the legal folks on that.
So
she's correct, Councilmember Clark. It's not a requirement that for public hearings for this board that you meet in person.
So folks, what I think I'm hearing is that we move to all virtual meetings for all situations.
Yes.
Is everyone in agreement with that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
Yes.
Staff, you'll develop the appropriate one. Now, the only exception there is we do have to meet in person in order to make this vote to go to all virtual.
Yes.
I think that is required. Okay.
Yes,
so,
that is
The
required.
old catch-22.
So make sure that we all know our September meeting will be in person to make the decision to go to all virtual. All right. Very good, members. Thank you for the discussion on that. Nice, very good guidance. Next item, Hunter, I believe you have our amendments, modifications that we'll be hearing next meeting.
Great, thank you, Mayor Horn. The item before you is agenda item number 9. It's the review of the fiscal year 2020 to 2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program amendments and modifications for the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. The fiscal year 2020 to 2029 MTIP is a comprehensive list of all transportation projects programmed for the Winston-Salem urban area, and it must be a subset of the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan, as well as match the Winston-Salem urban area MPO's projects that are listed in the FY 2020 to 2029 STIP. The North Carolina Department of Transportation regularly updates the STIP to include new projects and modify existing ones. Any STIP amendment for new statewide projects or projects within the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization triggers the amendment of the MTIP. STIP amendments for regionally significant projects that have significant project revisions or cross the FHWA's 4-year funding period or modeling horizon years require an air quality conformity determination report. Modifications to the STIP do not require adoption, but are provided for information. The attached document here describes the additions, deletions, amendments, and modifications to the FY 2020 to 2029 MTIP. As required by our public participation policy, these amendments and modifications to the MTIP were made available for public review and comment from June 12th through July 14th. During that time, no public comments were received. Only 2 notes that I'd make on this one specifically is there was an addition to the STIP at the MPO's request for the NC8 and Oak Summit Road intersection improvements. And then the other item is simply that the STIP modifications that are listed there were generally to allow for additional time for planning and design. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. Thanks.
Very good, members. You'll have a little over almost 2 months to review this before our September meeting. All righty. Matt, Patrick, you have the next item.
All right, thank you, Chairman Horn. Agenda item number 10 is a review of the program management plan update for reporting, managing, and overseeing FTA section 5310 and 5307 JARC grant funds in the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. This program management plan is the document that describes the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization's policies and procedures for administering the FTA Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities Award, Section 5310. FTA has defined the goal of the Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities Program in FTA Circular C9070.1G, which is to improve mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities throughout the country by removing barriers to transportation services and expanding the transportation mobility options available. Toward this goal, FTA provides financial assistance for transportation services planned, designed, and carried out to meet the special transportation needs of seniors and individuals with disabilities. The Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO also utilizes the program management plan to manage Section 5307 JARC, or Job Access and Reverse Commute funds, similarly to that of 5310. JARC funds enable low-income communities to access employment and educational opportunities via human services coordinated transit. The program management plan was developed through consulting with HDR, which included assessing and analyzing the grant management and oversight processes, along with the overall functions of 5310 and 5307 JARC programs within the greater transit context in the urban area. So I do ask that you hold off on asking any questions until after the next info item on the Human Services Transportation Plan, as Patrick, who works with our consultant HDR on these plans, will be giving a short presentation on the two plans that will be implemented in tandem. So for agenda item number 11, this is the review of the Coordinated Public Transportation Human Services Transportation Coordination Plan update for the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. Federal transportation law requires that the Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization develop a locally coordinated public transportation human services transportation plan. The purpose of the HST plan is to improve transportation services for persons with disabilities, older adults, and low-income individuals through a better coordinated transportation system. These plans coordinate public transit, paratransit, and transit services provided by local agencies and nonprofits. Federal law also requires that the plan be developed locally through a process that includes representatives of public, private, and nonprofit transportation and human service providers, and participation by the public. Plan updates are mandatory every 5 years to identify needs of the transportation disadvantaged. Additionally, the HST plan will help guide decision-making and the selection of transit projects supported by FTA funds. This plan update was developed through consulting with HDR, which included an intensive public outreach process, extensive existing conditions and mapping analyses, and identification of major goals for human services transportation in the MPO. And with that, I will pass it on to Patrick, and he'll be leading the presentation for these two plans.
All right, well,
welcome.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Chairman Horn. My name is Patrick McDonough. I'm a senior transit planner with HDR out of our Raleigh office. And I'm also a former Winston-Salem resident. I lived there from 1993 to 2001. So even virtually, it's good to be back. So with that, Hunter, let's go ahead and get right into the material. You've heard a little bit from Matt and some of the other staff here today about human services transportation, but just you'll hear me say HST to refer to that. But as a quick reminder, this is where we're identifying the needs of individuals with disabilities, low-income populations, and elderly residents. We're assessing the current transportation options that are available to them, and then we're developing strategies to improve their mobility and meet their unique needs. Next, please. Okay. Thank you. All right, so under our funding streams, there are a couple different things that help fund these programs. First is the federal. We have the Jobs Access Reverse Commute, which you've heard about just a few moments ago, and also Section 5310 for enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities. And then there's also 5311, which are formula grants for rural areas. At the state level, there's State Maintenance Assistance Program, which are our state dollars for transit operations. Next, please. Winston-Salem is fortunate to have a robust group of organizations and providers of transportation services working together. And one of the things that I learned as I came into this project is you also have a nice sort of informal group called Forsyth in Motion, where folks come together to share information. It's something that other communities should do as well. But on just kind of identifying who your key players are here, we have fixed route agencies such as WISTA and PART in Davidson County. Demand responsive providers, which includes Davidson County, Town of Kernersville, Uvalde, and then of course WISTA's TransAid service. On the private nonprofit providers, we have the Shepherd Center, the Life Center, the Workshop of Davidson. We have some private for-profit providers with Here to There and support systems of Forsyth County. And then on the nonprofit stakeholders who are not providing transportation but are partners, we have the Enrichment Center Wake Forest Baptist Health as well. And then within the local government sphere, we have building integrated communities helping also. And I would say if there's one thing you take away today to think about the strategic direction of these programs and how we plan for them, it's this chart. Basically, very strong message here. The 65 plus population all across the state and here in the Triad and here in Forsyth County is growing 3 times faster than the total population. And just a quick look at this, we're looking at the 2010 to 2019 population growth, both for the entire population on the left, and then to the right, the population age 65 plus. For Forsyth County, the total population grew about 9.4% in the last decade, but the age 65 plus growth rate was 34%. If you go down to the bottom there, you'll see North Carolina at 10.7% and an age 65 plus growth rate of 39.4%. And then if we come back up to Davidson County, you'll see that the overall population growth was 3% and the 65 plus rate was 32%. So what we're seeing here is that, and this is not unique to the Winston-Salem metro area at all, but we have a population growth rate for our elderly population, which is also more likely to have a disability, growing anywhere from 3 to 10 times the rate of the primary overall population. With that in mind, let's turn to funding. So if you were to distill the Forsyth County growth rate for age 65 plus from the prior chart down to an annualized rate, that would be about 3.7% growth each year. However, funding, primarily in the 5310 apportionments to Winston-Salem, has only grown about 1.3% from fiscal year 14 to fiscal year 21. So the need in the community is definitely growing. That's undeniable. The funding stream, though, is not growing at the same rate. So that's important to know. Next, please. Next, I'm going to talk about some key findings. And really what I'm going to be covering here is covering some results of a survey we did. This was mostly online due to the COVID situation in 2020 and 2021. Some of this surveying was done prior to when vaccines were available. So unfortunately, we were not able to have an in-person event. However, we did have a survey where we heard from caretakers and users of the service. We heard from providers, all of those ones I named earlier, in 4 separate meetings as well. And here's what we found. First, if you look at the right side of the screen, you can see our zip code distribution. So we heard from folks all over, folks north of Greensboro, up to Pilot Mountain, down to Lexington, out to Clemens, and here in the center of the county as well. But the destinations, where are people going on human service transportation? Work, medical appointments, personal trips, all very important. We did identify some barriers. 1/3 of the people in the survey said they had been unable to make a trip due to a lack of transportation that met their needs in the recent past. One thing that may be an opportunity is that not all of the participants in the survey have tried all of the services that may be available to them. So there's an opportunity where perhaps education could make better matches between needs and service. Cost is important to people. And this was, before inflation was even a bigger issue than it's become here in 2022. And then finally, access and eligibility. If I live in the rural portion of the county, am I eligible for this program or that program? If I live in the city limits, am I eligible? These types of questions people are navigating. And then, of course, we heard a lot about how COVID had changed people's travel behaviors. Next.
Patrick, one quick question.
Sure.
The 70 or 70 plus individuals who participated, were they demographically representative of the region, or were there certain demographic skews of the respondents?
No, excellent question. We took a look at that in the survey, and while we were a little bit off from Forsyth County's demographics and the MPO's demographics, we were mostly on target. And when I say mostly on target, for example, if you were looking at the percentage of white residents and Black residents in the metropolitan area, we were plus or minus a couple percent, not plus or minus 10 or 20%. And then I think our age profile probably did skew a little bit older than the general population. Again, because this is a program where it's reaching seniors and people with disabilities, that's a bit to be expected. And then some of the younger people participating, they might be caretakers for somebody who is a senior or a disabled individual. But we felt pretty good about the match to the overall population, and we can share that data with you if that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
No, great question. So let's talk a little bit about service gaps and service needs. I'd say the first point here is that the providers are seeing an increase in need for curb-to-curb service, where someone is driving someone to a destination and then getting out and helping them walk to the door of their home or to the door of a medical facility. And in the past, the service has been more needs for door-to-door, whereas in the past, it had been more curb-to-curb. And one of our providers made a great quote, and they said, built a system that was designed to transport those aged 65 to 70 who are living at home. But now medical progress, we're transporting people who are 80 to 90 living at home. And those folks are more likely to be frail and more likely to have some cognitive challenges that they need more assistance to make their trips. So that's one thing to note. On the fixed route bus system side, there are folks who are able to use the bus system, but they're afraid that they can't walk to the bus stop safely. Maybe there's not a sidewalk in their neighborhood, or the crosswalk is not present, or the walk across, a road like Stratford would be, too long, and they're afraid they can't make it before the light changes. And another challenge we're seeing is that our medical facilities are decentralizing. When I lived in Winston-Salem, the two big hospitals were Baptist and Forsyth, but of course now we've got Novant out in Clemens, Wake Forest Davie Medical Center, the VA is in Kernersville, and the key destinations for some of these medical trips are, further out than the core of Winston-Salem. On the service needs side, those outside the 3/4 mile service area have a little bit inconsistent access. I remember somebody who said, I'm outside the city limits, I live in the county, I can see the city limits from my house, but I can only get picked up by TransAid if TransAid has a vehicle coming out this way, if there's space in the vehicle, and if those two conditions aren't met, they're out of luck and they have to try again tomorrow. So, there's definitely a need for more drivers and vehicles. We've heard about that with bus driver shortages. That's a national phenomenon right now, and more vehicles as well. So next, please. I'm going to run through the strategies that are in the Human Service Transit Plan report. I'm probably going to not hit all of them, but I'm going to hit the most important ones. In the short term, and this is really now through 2024, one of the things that's going on is a change in the scoring weights for projects in the program management plan. I'm going to hit that more in detail in just a few slides. But here are some other key actions that should go on. Creating passenger and provider portals on the MPO website. So if you're a provider, you know where to get an application, you know which forms you have to fill out. You can see, a training video of Matt Duchesne or somebody else who did a webinar on how to, become familiar with the process. If you're a passenger, you're able to see what services are available, who can I call, and how can I schedule an appointment, things of that nature. The second item is establishing a reimbursement per trip schedule from the MPO to HTST providers. Some of our providers said there are times they feel like they're negotiating with nonprofits, and the nonprofits feel like they only have so much money to give. And so if there's a schedule of how much is paid per trip, it helps the providers plan their operational budgets, and it helps the nonprofit providers know what to expect. And it lets people focus on the trip making rather than the money. Also, we've got some great volunteer programs going on, but more volunteer drivers could be needed. So any ways that could be enhanced is good. And also just sharing more information about these services with the community. Next, please. In the medium term, a few other actions. So this is, things that would take place in the 2025 to 2027 timeframe. And the first one is a reimbursement agreement that could be explored across WISTA, PART, and maybe other fixed route providers. Here in the triangle where I am, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Cary, this type of agreement has been in place for about 10 years. And it works like this. If Go Durham has a person who needs to go into Go Raleigh service area, Go Durham is allowed to drive over that line and just go right into Raleigh, instead of the Go Raleigh vehicle coming and meeting Go Durham at the county line and having somebody in a wheelchair make a cumbersome transfer. What happens basically is the Go Durham vehicle goes into Raleigh, and then Raleigh puts a payment to Go Durham in the background to make them whole for going outside their service area. And this has benefits for dispatch. It makes the dispatchers, they're dispatching one vehicle instead of two. The customer likes it because they don't have to transfer. And it just makes things a lot simpler. But by moving the money around, I think there's a reconciliation once a month. This doesn't mean it's always going to be a vehicle, the best thing to work. And, but it's something where if, for say, Go Durham is slammed one day and Go Raleigh has 4 extra vehicles, Go Durham might be able to call on Go Raleigh to come over and do a trip in Go Durham's territory, and then the reimbursement agreement makes Go Raleigh whole. So it's a way to think about how you can partner to utilize the full fleet in the region rather than the region by provider. Partnering with job training organizations. This is just helping people who are getting job skills and learning how to get to a new opportunity to go, hey, when you get the job with these new skills, that there's an ecosystem of people who can help you get there. Also encouraging employers to assist with costs of employee transportation. Some employers do pass programs with up to a half or even a full reimbursement of a monthly pass on transit. I think on the fixed route transit side, we see the hope to expand more frequent with WISTA service and expanding WISTA's hours on nights and weekends and Sunday. And then finally, trying to bring more vehicles and geographic expanse to the table just to meet more the needs of people who have disabilities and seniors. Finally, let's go to the long term. these are things that are really kind of out there a little bit further, 2028 to 2030. One of the things where regions that have multiple providers are doing is many of them are moving to what we call centralized trip brokerage. And that's instead of having a number for Part, a number for Worcester, a number for Davidson County, a fourth number for Yadkin, there's one number a person calls and says, I'm a senior citizen, I'm a person with a disability, I'm trying to make this kind of trip. And the brokerage does all the figuring out. It figures out, oh, well, yeah, you're a great match for this nonprofit volunteer service. Oh, you're a good match for Worcester Transaid. And so that does take some coordination across multiple partners, but it does generate some efficiencies when it's executed well. On the fixed route side, providing early morning and late night service on the fixed route service to give more people access to early work opportunities. If you're someone who starts an early shift at a hospital, those early morning services are very helpful. Establishing 24/7 trip planning. There's a small city smaller than Winston up in Massachusetts that if you get on at 2 a.m. and you're a caretaker and you want to plan a trip for a person who you're helping tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m., you can make that happen and get into the dispatcher's queue if there's a vehicle available. That type of web-enabled scheduling can be very helpful. And then finally, simply promoting alternative transportation options throughout the region. Next slide. Last bit of discussion here before we get to questions that people may have. You heard Matt talk about the program management plan a few minutes ago, and really there are two things that the program management plan is doing in the next couple of years through this work we've done. One is clarifying expectations and protocols for providers for when they're applying for 5310 and JARC funds. And the other is to update the scoring criteria for both of those to emphasize program effectiveness and project budget. On the expectations side, one of the things that I think is a nice, exciting innovation that'll happen here is the type of application materials that providers will need to submit actually exemplify the behaviors of what a good reporting provider should be doing if they receive money. So if you're filling the application out correctly, you are doing the things that you will need to be complying correctly. And so that helps the staff know that somebody has, hey, read the material on the website, they tuned in for the How to Do It webinar, and they're on the ball as they submit their materials. Then these proposals are scored by a committee of folks to see where the money is allocated. On program effectiveness, what's happening in the program management plan is that is becoming the highest point value so that we're driving a push towards how many providers that are innovating and serving more people per dollar spent. Those are the ones who are, getting first in line for funding. And then on the project budget side, it's how well do you specifying, here's your plan for the year. Here are my expenses for fuel, for labor, and this is how we're going to do it and cover it. And so when somebody has a really well-developed plan for how they're budgeting, there's a better chance they're going to execute. And these scoring criteria are trying to reward that level of thoroughness and innovation. And I think that's really where we're done. So I'm happy to take questions, happy to work with Matt to answer them.
Mr. McDonough, I have a question. Bill Apple here. Pat Ivy did me the great favor of inviting me to attend the North Carolina 2022, the Transportation Summit in Raleigh, which was a 2-day summit 2 or 3 months ago. And one of the subjects that was discussed there was the category of microtransit. There was a gentleman from down in Wilson who described their very successful implementation of a microtransit plan. We actually had him visit and talk with us and share some of their experience with it. Are any of the other municipalities in this region considering or have you implemented microtransit?
So first of all, great question and very timely, Mr. Apple, because Wilson was actually on NPR today being covered for that innovation itself. And it might be Roger Lentz out in Wilson. I've worked with him before and they have a very innovative approach there. Let me tell you about a few things that are going on in the Raleigh-Durham area that I've seen. So the first is at Go Triangle, which is the regional public transit provider. Think of them as our part. They did a pilot where the shuttles in Research Triangle Park had a pretty low passenger per hour productivity rating. And so they were trying to see if they could innovate and do something there. They wound up doing a geo-fenced voucher for Uber and Lyft trips. So if you're within a certain area of Research Triangle Park, as long as the trip began or ended in that zone, you could book a trip on Uber and it would give you a $10 coupon. And what they found is by doing the $10 coupon effect, they actually got to, 2 or 3 more passengers per hour, which was like a 75% improvement for the money they were spending on that service. Now, there was one drawback, which is that the Uber and Lyft vehicles were not ADA accessible. So it was a program where they proved that there's an opportunity here, but that there's a few shortcomings. So one of the things that was done in response to that is Go Durham is now doing a pilot with an ADA, a wheelchair-equipped vehicle in East Durham, which is a lower income neighborhood where we have a lot of zero-car households, some of whom are disabled. And so by having Go Durham doing that with a vehicle that meets ADA criteria, they're able to bring people either to the transit center or to the nearest frequent route that runs every 15 minutes. And everybody's looking at like, what is the passenger per hour productivity of that? Does a small area ensure better productivity? Does does 3 vehicles over 8 square miles make it? Does, a lot of vehicles over, a wider area make it work best? So we're really in kind of a trial and error phase. I think what Wilson's doing is really interesting. I think those other 2 case studies are interesting. And then of course we need to be mindful of our federal mandates around service for everyone. But it's a great question to be interested in.
Well, my next question would be, would you be able and willing, maybe through Kelly, I don't know whether anybody else is interested or not, but could I get a copy of your slide presentation, all 14 pages of that?
Yes, sir. I will make those available after this meeting.
Okay. I don't think that's in our materials. I missed it if they are.
No, it's not.
Okay, but that'd be great information I'd like to pass on to our staff to take a look at. Please.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Apple. Any other questions? Very good. Patrick, just a distinction, and I know I get confused in my mind. 5310 is primarily for senior population and JARVAC is primarily for employment. Is that correct?
Largely, yes. 5310 for seniors and individuals with disabilities, and JARC is more focused about work trips.
Great, thank you. Okay. Members, any question? Kelly, or I should say, Matt, what will we be doing next or in 2 months on this? Or do we approve this, or is this just an informational item?
This is information for this go around, and then it'll be up for approval.
Approval. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other questions? Patrick, thank you very much for taking time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Kelly, you have our final informational item.
Yes, sir. So the item before you is for information. It's an amendment of our fiscal year 2022-2023 Unified Planning Work Program for the NPO. Each year, the Winston Urban Area NPO is required to develop its UPWP for transportation and transit planning. The document identifies what transportation and transit planning projects and work tasks will be completed during the fiscal year and the estimated amount of federal and state highway and transit planning funds that will be used to complete the work, of course, plus the required local matches. On March 17th of this year, the TAC did adopt the fiscal year 2022-2023 UPWP. Per our federally funded project methodology, 5% of our direct attributable funds were allocated to our UPWP for planning purposes. The TAC approved the allocation of additional funding in May at the May 19 meeting, May 19, 2022 meeting. Staff is then recommending that 52,000 of these funds be used for Davidson County Transportation, Community Transportation Service Plan Update. DCT would be responsible for the match of $13,000, making the project a total of $65,000. And then staff is also recommending that the Village of Clements pedestrian plan be moved from our prior fiscal year, which is FY 2021-2022, to fiscal year 2022-2023, since the project was a little bit delayed. The amended UPWP is attached for your review. This is for information. I'll answer any questions you may have. It'll come back for action next month, September.
Very good. Any questions for Kelly? Members, take a look at that, because there's a lot of work that's going to be programmed in for the next year. So it's a lot of stuff going on. Kelly, anything else on that?
No, sir.
Very good. Members, we're at the point in our program where you're free to look at the various staff reports and presentations. If any of them jump out at you that you would like a little more elaboration at this meeting, please say so now. Otherwise, we'll move down to our scheduling of our next meeting.
Chairman
Anybody
Horn,
have-
this is Brent Rocket.
Yes, sir, Brent.
Is Carrie with the Forsyth County Environmental Protection Agency here present?
Brent, I don't believe I see her.
Okay, well, if he's not there, I would like in the future explanation on the x-axis, what units those are on the air quality report. And I think it would also be helpful on the PM 2.5 and the ozone to have the standard listed also.
Very good.
So if we can pass that along to Carrie.
Absolutely. I think that would be helpful because we're in a critical time, like you're saying, particularly with air quality during these summer months, and we'll have a pretty good synopsis of it, I guess, in September. So maybe they can be available to dive in a little deeper at that point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, anything else? Mr. Ivy, you're very quiet. Do you have anything you wish to contribute here?
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I'll say is that I think everybody knows that as part of the state budget, there was some additional funding from the sales and use tax transfer that came to DOT that has potential to help us out in terms of STIP funding, particularly in our draft. We're waiting for updated revenue forecasts so they can determine what impact that will actually have. So there'll be more information coming in the very near future. Very exciting news for us and quite unprecedented.
That's fabulous, Pat. In fact, I'm looking at our program. Those are the ones that say schedule subject to adjustment is what you're talking about that potentially could see some changes.
Well, not so much in the presentation or the report that I provided to you today, but from the draft 2024-2033 TIP that was released, we believe that we may have the opportunity to do another revision, which may actually add more projects to that. So stay tuned.
Great. Thank you. Members, any other comments? We're toward the end of our meeting. First off, I want to say thank you very much for sticking with us. It's been a little bit longer meeting than usual, but we've covered a lot of important things. And as Mr. Clark would say, we've given away millions of dollars. Members, any other questions, suggestions, comments? If not, our next meeting is September 15th. Remember, this is an in-person meeting. So we'll get information on. I believe we'll be meeting with the Joycelyn Johnson, what's the official name of Joycelyn Johnson Maintenance
Municipal Service Center.
Municipal Service Center. Thank you. And that's over, as I understand, in the old Bonson area where Mr. Clark worked for some of the summers. Very good. With that, members, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Marion.
I think Mr. Marion made the motion, and I think Mr. Combest made the second. Kelly, we can just do this by voice vote, can't we?
Yes, sir.
Very good. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, folks, again. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for your contributions today. We are adjourned.
Thank you.